going to begin this class about Thanksgiving and gratitude. I want to begin with the gratitude part. Number one, the idea that we learn about gratitude and where do we see it in the Torah and how this plays into Thanksgiving, I think is always a great conversation. But what I want to talk about is one of the things that I learned as a kid, and many of you might have learned this in Hebrew school or in Jewish day school, or maybe you've just heard the story. We always talk about Abraham's tent. Abraham being the first Jew, we know that he is a man that discovers God on his own. And once he discovers God, his most important mission in life is to teach it to others. And there's a very famous story, I think this is in the Midrash, that says that Abraham's father was a master craftsman, and he had a store that was full of idols of stone, different sizes, shapes. So one day he comes into the store and he sees that all of the idols are broken, destroyed. And he looks at his son, and his son says, "It wasn't me. Look, there's one standing, and it was him." And in that big idol's hand, Abraham puts an axe or a hammer, and he says, "It was that one." So his father looks at him and says, "Are you crazy? We all know that these idols are just stone. They can't do that. They can't fight and destroy each other. It's not true." So he says, "So then why are you worshiping them? If they're just stone, what are you wasting your time?" So Abraham had this tent, and in the desert, there were many passing travelers that would travel through town, travel through the desert, travel through the different parts of the desert from city to city. No water, no food for miles, if they even had miles or kilometers then, however they measured their distances. And Abraham's tent, it says, as we're taught, had an opening on each side. He wanted people to be able to come through to his tent. He would give them food, give them drink, and most importantly, he would give them an education. What did he educate them about? God. How did he do that? So after a person would finish eating, he would say thank you to Abraham, and Abraham would say, "No, just thank God." He says, "What God? I don't believe in this God." And they would have a conversation. And most times, these people would not want to acknowledge God, the one God. So Abraham would instead give them a bill. And the bill was quite expensive. And he would tell them the reason why it's so expensive. He says, "Do you see any other restaurant out here in the desert? So my prices there's no competition." And that would further their conversation, where he would educate them about one God, that everything that we have in this world comes from him. Even if we have a good crop or we have wheat, this is because of God's blessings. And to use Steve Meyer when he gave his tour of Egypt in pictures, for me, the Nile River was one of the pictures that just brought back a memory that we always talk about, with the story of Egypt and why they worshiped the Nile and why some of the plagues specifically targeted the Nile. Because the Nile to them was a god. Every single year, their crops were dependent on the Nile's not flooding or just having a good enough water, having a good enough water level, because that's how they watered their crops. That's how they had all of their food for the year. And if the Nile wasn't participating, then what did you have? You had a year of famine. So the Egyptians worshiped the Nile, and God in his 10 plagues was trying to educate them. This is just water, but I create the water. I can make it blood. I can make it lower, higher. So the fact is we're taught throughout all of our Jewish texts, and this is where I'm just going to do a quick rundown because I think many of us know this already, that we are taught through the Torah and through many of our teachings that we have to be gracious and grateful to God for all the blessings that we have. And here are just some of the examples that we find. Number one is we're always taught about blessings. We wake up in the morning, we thank God for giving us our soul back. We eat food, we have a blessing before, which is rabbinic, but we have a blessing when we are full and satiated. We do the Birkat HaMazon, we do the grace after meals, and we thank God that this food has filled me up, has sustained me, and that I even have food. Part of the blessing is all about that. Because the fact is, you can be punished. When I say punished, I don't mean literally, but we could have that illness where a person eats and doesn't feel full. and we have people who eat too much and never feel full. So we count our blessings, and we show our gratitude by thanking God and blessing God at the end of a meal. So we find this throughout the Torah, but I'm going to highlight two more things that we find in the Torah, and the lessons are endless, and the things that we can point to in the Torah are truly endless. But here are two more. Number one is challah. Today is a Friday, we're going to eat challah, most of us, on Shabbat. And even if you aren't, any bread that you have, when you make bread, there is a mitzvah to separate a portion of the dough, and that portion is called challah. That portion is given to the Kohen, is given to the priest, as a thank you to God for giving us all of the blessings that we can even have bread. So challah is there to remind us that our blessings come from God. We make a blessing over this, and the bread is now called challah. So even though we know for Shabbos our challah is braided, these are extra traditions, but really any batch of dough that is made that is large enough, there is challah taken from that batch. The same thing is another very known mitzvah in the Torah that many of us might know a little bit about, but I just want to share a little bit, and then later I'm going to share more about it. That is bikurim, the first fruits. It says that when the Jewish people would have the temple, the first fruits that were taken from a person's property, from their crop, were brought to Jerusalem as a thank you. Thank you to God for giving us these fruits. So we didn't eat the first fruits, we brought it to the temple. And in addition to that, the procession and the journey that a person would take from his home to Jerusalem, it says that people would come out of the street of their homes and accompany these people as they passed from town to town and celebrate with them. There was so much great joy. So we're taught in the Torah all about gratitude. Another thing that I think I might have mentioned this closer to Purim, so you might have heard this from me, but a lot of us never realize, when did the Jewish people get the name Jewish? Because if you think about it, in the Torah we're called B'nai Yisrael, which means the children of Israel, or many times you'll see it as the Israelites. So when did we get this name Jew? The first time that you really find Jews being called Jews is the story of Purim, where it says Mordechai ha-Yehudi, Mordechai the Jew. Now, the thing is, just to sort of give a little bit of clarity here, Jewish people being called Jews really fits to the tribe of Judah. Yehuda was one of the 12 tribes. So his tribe, it made sense to be called Yehudi, which we in English call Jew. But the other tribes would be called by their tribe. So, for example, Mordechai was not from the tribe of Yehuda. He was actually from the tribe of Benjamin. So he should have been called Mordechai the Benjamite. But in the Megillah, we call him Mordechai ha-Yehudi, Mordechai the Jew. And there are two meanings to the name Yehuda. So the first meaning, and we look at this when Leah, who is the wife of Jacob, has her fourth child, she's very excited because she knows there are 4 wives to Jacob. So if you split the children equally, each wife would have 3 children. But Yehuda is the 4th child born to her. And she's like, wait a second, now I know that I'm not just going to be one of 4, but I'm more important because somebody is going to have less children than 3. So it's not going to be split evenly. So she thanked God. And the word Yehuda has 2 meanings. Number 1, it's all about gratitude. And number 2, it's about acknowledgement. So one of the reasons why Jewish people are called Jews is for this very reason, that we are thankful and grateful to God. And I want to read something. I do not know the author to this. When I was searching the internet to find a Jewish text on the name Yehuda and how Yehuda is a meaning of being grateful, I found this paragraph that I thought embodies this message. And here is the text. A Jew must always feel this same sense of gratitude to God, continually recognizing that he is the recipient of heavenly blessings, the antithesis of a sense of entitlement. A Jew must acknowledge that he is a debtor who owes so much to his past, to his forebears and his progenitors. He is not a creditor to whom something is owed. This attitude of gratitude is reflected in his name, his identity, and shapes his essential character. And this is Yehudi. Again, this is based off of the root of the word Yehuda in Hebrew, is to acknowledge, to be thankful. So we find in Judaism this idea of gratitude. And like we mentioned, Thanksgiving is really all about being thankful. It's Thanksgiving. So here is, I think, a good little recap for those of you who don't know the history of Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving began before the United States declared independence. Before we were independent nation, the Puritans, the original settlers of America, actually would celebrate Thanksgiving. And what was it? If they had a very good winter that it didn't destroy their crops, they would sit down for a Thanksgiving meal. In fact, I read that in those days they were on good terms with the Native Americans. They would invite them to their dinners. So Thanksgiving was this idea that the settlers, the original people living in America, were being thankful to God that the crop that they had, their winter was not so harsh, and they had what to live. So they would do this Thanksgiving meal. In the 1780s, they came to George Washington. They said, let's make a Thanksgiving holiday. George Washington declares a national day of Thanksgiving, a Thanksgiving holiday, but he does not make it a national holiday for the future. He does it just for that year. It's only in 1863, during Abraham Lincoln's tenure as president, that he proclaims Thanksgiving. This is October 3rd, 1863. He does the Thanksgiving proclamation. And here is the thing that many of us may know, but never really read it. If you have not read the Thanksgiving proclamation, I'm going to share the text of it in a moment on the screen. You find that the entire proclamation is about saying thank you to God. It's about being grateful to God, because Abraham recognized a holiday without God to thank is truly meaningless. So here is the text. I'm going to share my screen so you can read it. I'm going to read it out loud, though. Give me a second. All right, so this is the Thanksgiving text of the proclamation. I'm going to zoom in so you can see even larger. So on October 3rd, 1863, Abraham Lincoln signed the original Thanksgiving proclamation. In it, he stated, and here's the text: "We have been the recipients of the choicest bounties of heaven. We have been preserved these many years in peace and prosperity. We have grown in numbers, wealth, and power as no other nation has ever grown. But we have forgotten God. We have forgotten the gracious hand which preserved us in peace and multiplied and enriched and strengthened us. And we have vainly imagined in the deceitfulness of our hearts that all these blessings were produced by some superior wisdom and virtue of our own. Intoxicated with unbroken success, we have become too self-sufficient to feel the necessity of redeeming and preserving grace, too proud to pray to the God that made us. It has seemed to me fit and proper that God should be solemnly, reverently, and gratefully acknowledged, as with one heart and one voice, by the whole American people. I do, therefore, invite my fellow citizens in every part of the United States, and also those who are at sea and those who are sojourning in foreign lands, to set apart and observe the last Thursday of November as a day of thanksgiving and praise to our beneficent Father who dwelleth in the heavens." I had actually never read this proclamation until this year, and it's quite powerful to realize how God-centric, if I can use that word, the proclamation was, to really be thankful to God. So I think that Judaism already teaches us this, and that's why as a child I used to ask my father, do we celebrate Thanksgiving or not? These types of questions. And the answer is always, we have Thanksgiving every single day. And the truth is we do, right? We don't need to set aside a single day, because if you're living Jewishly, you realize it's steeped in so many things that we do. Literally from the moment that we wake up, we say Moda'ani. We haven't even gotten out of bed. There is a prayer that says, "Thank you, God, for giving me my life today." And it puts you in a really good mindset that I have a purpose. There's a reason why I'm alive. There is a reason to be here. And there's a reason why I'm here. So this is a lot about gratitude that we find in the Torah and that we find in Thanksgiving holiday. I will share something at the end, which I think is some really powerful messages of how to add some gratitude in our own lives and what it can do to us, but not based off of Jewish texts, just from a course that I had taught called How Happiness Thinks. But before that, I just wanted to cover two other questions. And that is, as a Jew, can I celebrate Thanksgiving? So I know earlier when I mentioned the outline of what we're going to discuss, there was someone who said that, of course. Well, let me share something interesting. There is a prohibition in the Torah to imitate Gentile customs. So now the question is, if the holiday of Thanksgiving is not Jewish, well, the first thing is, who created it? Like the original Thanksgiving holiday, was it created by the Puritans and that was a religious holiday? Or is this truly nothing to do with a religion, but just people being thankful to God? So let's say we've analyzed the holiday and we say that it has nothing to do with a religious holiday. It's not Catholic, it's not Christian, it's not Protestant, it's not some specifically steeped in religion, but it's just a moment, a day that we pause and thank God. So let's say that is what it is. Let's talk about the prohibition of imitating the Gentile customs. There are generally two types of rabbinic thoughts on what the prohibition is and what it is not. And I'm going to share both of them. One line of thought is that when it says that you cannot imitate Gentile customs, it means for sure not anything that is idolatrous. So if it came from idol worship or from the church, you wouldn't be allowed to do it. But it also includes anything that comes from a Gentile. So for example, if the custom on the street, if I can use that word, is that doctors wear white lab coats and it began from a non-Jewish person, then imitating the non-Jewish customs would mean that I, as a doctor, I put on a white lab coat. Or I will give you, I think, another example that's not religious in nature. If certain styles of dress begin from the non-Jewish sector, then we cannot imitate those styles. So if red shoelaces is in, I shouldn't be using red shoelaces. But this includes many things, which would include Thanksgiving. Then you have a second line of thought from the rabbis, and this is the more prevalent one, that the prohibition of imitating the Gentile customs is specifically religious in nature. So, for example, if I knew that Thanksgiving began from the church because of the church and because of a verse in the New Testament, there is absolutely no way that either of these two opinions would allow it. So, to put it out there, can you celebrate Thanksgiving according to this prohibition? If the prohibition is about any custom that begins from the Gentiles, the answer is clearly no. But if it's only customs that were pagan in nature, then the answer would be you can. Should you? Different question. And I'm not touching that today. But can you? The answer would be you can. The general consensus of the modern day halachic, meaning the Jewish law authorities, is that you can. Should you? Again, I'm not touching that subject. That's each person on their own. But the answer is you can. It's not coming from a religious entity, if you want to call it that. It came from people on their own goodwill and good feeling to thank God, which is obviously a beautiful thing. So the short answer is, as a Jew, can you celebrate Thanksgiving? Yes, you can. Now, I do want to share something interesting, though, just on that note. If you notice that your congregation starts feeling like a church, in the sense of the dress of the rabbi, how they're wearing whatever they're wearing, you say, oh, I noticed that in X and Y denomination, that's a problem according to this prohibition. So again, it's never a simple question. although we have a simple answer. That's what I was trying to share earlier. The question is, obviously, I have a text on my computer that goes through every single rabbinic written answer about Thanksgiving. Like if you really want to analyze it and see what they say, there is a lot to this. I shared it very simple and in its most simplistic way. Now, the last question that I share is about turkey. Are turkeys kosher? Now, you and I know we can go into Trader Joe's right now and buy a turkey. So I would think that we would all agree that turkeys are kosher. However, like I mentioned, it's not such a simple question. So the answer is quite simple. We eat turkey. But how we got to that is not as simple. So what I want to share is, in general, what makes a bird kosher, what makes food kosher, and then I'm going to talk about the turkey itself. So kosher food has specific criteria of what makes it kosher. If it's a fish, the fish must have fins and scales. Those are two identifying marks that the Torah tells us about that says if you see it on a fish, it's kosher. You don't even have to do anything. You kill it, you can put it straight onto a barbecue or your oven or your pot, however you want to do it. Then it talks about animals and birds. But I'm going to talk about animals first. Animals, it says, they must chew their cud and they must have split hooves. Now, a camel chews its cud. It does not have split hooves. A pig has split hooves. It doesn't chew its cud. Those are not kosher. They only have one identifying sign. They are not kosher. So in the end of the day, if an animal has split hooves and it chews its cud, and for those of you who don't know, chewing its cuds means it regurgitates its food. It swallows it, spits it back up, chews it some more, puts it back down. It's a process. So these two signs make an animal kosher. However, they are not ready to be eaten. They're only eaten after you slaughter it properly. And then you have to salt it, which removes the blood. We check it that it was healthy. And then you can now go and eat that animal. So it's a process. What about birds? The Torah for birds does not give identifying signs. What it does do, it gives 24 birds that are not kosher. It lists birds that are not kosher. It doesn't tell you what is kosher. It tells you what's not kosher. The problem is we don't always remember, or we don't necessarily know what are those 24 non-kosher birds. So what do we do because of that? We only eat birds that we have a tradition that they are kosher. So, for example, we know that chickens are kosher. We know that duck is kosher. So the common practice is we follow this tradition that we always, if we have a tradition that it's kosher, great. If we don't have a tradition, we don't eat it. Turkey is a problem. Turkey is a bird that was only introduced to Europe in the 16th century. It's a New World bird. So we don't have this ongoing tradition regarding its kosher status. So I'm going to share two things that are of interest, I think, to me. One is, in general, when you start looking at the bird list of what's kosher, like the ones that we do have a tradition, they are not birds of prey. Not a single one are birds of prey. Many of them are not wild. So it's kind of, does the turkey fit into this category or not? There is another thing that the rabbis use to answer the question about turkey, and that is turkeys, in general, birds, not turkeys, but birds that are kosher species cannot mate with non-kosher species, not because we don't let them. It's a fact that they can interbreed if they are kosher. If they are not kosher, they just don't breed with other types of birds. So since turkeys were able to mate with certain breeds that were known to be kosher, that was one of the ways that they knew that the turkey was kosher, because it was able to mate with kosher birds. However, I share this with a little bit of interesting note. The question came up to a rabbi who sees a turkey for the first time in his life, and the turkey is quite wild. And he says, I don't care what others are saying, This bird is so wild, it can't be Jewish. It can't be kosher. It just doesn't have a kosher trait. So any descendant of this rabbi, his name was the Shalah. If you are a descendant of his family, his name is Rabbi Yeshaya Halevi Horowitz. He was known as the Shalah. If you are a descendant of his family, you would not eat turkey. Anyone else eats turkey. I eat turkey. I'm not a descendant of his family. But I do have a cousin that somewhere in his family, whether it's I think it's his father's side, they are descendants of that rabbi. They do not eat turkey. So again, are turkeys kosher? Yes. Does everyone agree with that? No. And then again, how do we know it's kosher? This tradition doesn't help us, but we do have other ways of figuring that out. So that is my little, what I want to call, I don't want to call it a spiel, but that is what I wanted to share today about the holiday of Thanksgiving. What I want to end off with, and then I'll take any question, is a couple of texts that I think are important. We talk about being happy. The fact is that today people are not so happy. In fact, there is a book that was written by the professor Tal Ben Shahar. So here is a very interesting I guess an interesting note. Harvard University has a class about happiness that is its most well-attended class, meaning you'd think that in Harvard, where people are all about business and success, you'd think that maybe an economics class would be its most well-attended class. The fact is, people are looking for happiness, and this professor's class is the most well-attended class at Harvard. In fact, grandparents were coming to the class as well. Parents were joining their children. So one of the things that he mentions, and I'm just going to this is in his book, Learn the Secrets to Daily Joy and Lasting Fulfillment. He uses two studies that were done, one in the 1960s and one in 2005, I think. So study number one was that in the United States, the rates of depression are 10 times higher today than they were in the 1960s. So they did this study and they found that not just in the United States, but even in Europe. Here is a statistic from Europe. In 1957, 52% of Britain said they were very happy. And then in 2005, despite the fact that every country, at least first world countries, were doing so well in the sense of wealth, and they tripled their wealth over the last half century. In 2005, how many people were happy? Only 36%. So even though we are doing so much better in the sense of prosperity, happiness is not increasing. And there was a leading scholar in the field of positive psychology that asked this question. He said, if we are so rich, why aren't we happy? So I want to share a few, I guess, Jewish ideas about this and end off with one idea that I thought is a great idea for all of us that could help us be grateful. So here is a quote from Helen Keller that many of you probably know. This is from her book, 3 Days to See. Or actually, it's from an article. One of the things that she says is she asked a friend and said, who had just gone on a walk. And they said, what did you see outside? A long walk in the woods. What did her friend answer? She said, nothing in particular. So Helen Keller quoted off of that. She thought about it and she said she would have been surprised, but she already learned long ago that the seeing see little. Right? We have all of these faculties, but we're not grateful for them. In fact, she said that if only people would lose a little bit of their faculty for a couple days, they would appreciate it so much more. If we weren't able to see, we would appreciate sight so much more. If we weren't able to hear, we'd appreciate hearing so much more. So the fact is that we're less happy. What can we do to be happy? So one of the things, like I mentioned, is you find in the Jewish texts that how and what is the way to be happy. So I'm going to share two texts that we find in Jewish authors. One is from Rabbi Bachya ibn Pakuda. He was the author of the Chovot HaLevavot. For those of you who know, it's a very famous work on Musar. And he says, people neglect to contemplate the benefits God bestows upon them because the sole aspiration on which their hearts are fixed is further satisfaction of their desires and fulfillment of their wishes. Whatever stage of success they attain, they seek to proceed higher and further. Kind of like what Helen Keller said, we never stop to smell the roses. When we've gotten to a level of success, we just want more. We don't pause and appreciate where we are. And a Chabad rabbi, the fifth Chabad Rabbi, he adds something that I always think about. He says, when a person pours his feelings of love into words, the act of speaking these words fuels and intensifies the love. So if you speak more about it, that emotional energy radiates with more passion, and the person is aroused with more love and fondness for the object that they love. So with that knowledge, what does he say? This is the same thing to all emotions, right? If you don't express it through speech and you just think about it, they eventually dissipate. But if you actually verbalize it, they grow. And I mentioned in the beginning of the discussion today that we have a mitzvah of the bikurim, right? That you bring the first fruits to Jerusalem, but you didn't just drop off your fruit. This is what I wanted to share. You didn't just bring your bowl and give it to the Kohen. There was actually an entire passage that you would say. And what was this passage? You read all about the Jewish people, how we came from Israel, from before Egypt, but that there was someone who wanted to destroy our forefather, went down to Egypt, right? We became a big nation. The Egyptians tried to afflict us and treat us cruelly. We cried out to God. God saw our plight, took us out of Egypt. What does he do with many miracles? Right? He brought us to Israel, to this place. And then, holding the basket, they tell God and the priest, behold, I have brought the first fruit of the ground that you, God, have given me. We verbalize it. We vocalize, thank you, God. Because saying it, just the action is good. But saying it is even better. And what does it say after you do that? This is the verse. The verse says, and you shall rejoice in all the good that God, your God, has given you and your family. Right? By doing this, we will be happy. We're thankful to God. What happened? The Jewish people lose the temple. We don't have a Beit HaMikdash. We don't have the temple anymore to do the first fruits. One of the things that it says is Moses realized that we wouldn't have these action and events that help us be grateful. So what did he do? We learned that we pray 3 times a day now, right? Why are we praying? Because we're vocalizing, we're verbalizing our gratitude to God. So, like I mentioned, we are all about being grateful. But grateful is not just in here. Grateful is more than that. Grateful is to vocalize and say, God, thank you. Thank you for waking me up. Thank you for being there for me. We do this not just to God, we do this to our parents. In fact, we know that in the 10 Commandments, it says you have to honor your father and mother. There is a book, a sefer, a Jewish text that talks about every mitzvah. And when it talks about the mitzvah of loving your father, honoring your father and mother, and loving your parents, I think honoring your parents is the more proper way to share that. He says that it's proper to acknowledge and repay the kindness that one has received. In other words, why do we have the mitzvah to honor your parents? Because we don't want to be an ingrate. We don't want to be ungrateful. We have to be grateful. So if they brought you into this world and treated you and gave you food and put you through school and raised you, the fact is you got to thank them. And the last thing that I'll share before I read that last text that I think is a great piece of practical advice Why wasn't Moses allowed to do the first two plagues? His brother Aaron actually began those plagues or initiated them. It was because they involved the Nile River. And the Nile River is something that saved his life. So being grateful, he could not be the one that would hurt the Nile River and turn it into blood or make the frogs come out of the Nile. So we preach gratitude, and we preach gratitude not just in a way that is sort of abstract, but in Judaism, we preach it in a way that's practical. We thank God, we make blessings, we honor our parents, and we see this messaging everywhere. So here's my last text that I love. I read this a number of years ago. I share this a lot. I hope you'll like it too. This is from a book that was published in 2013. I'm going to read the text. In 1998, my colleague, it's from a professor, Robert Emmons. He's a doctor, a PhD, and the book is called Gratitude Works. Practical advice. In 1998, my colleague, Mike McCullough, and I designed a program of research to examine the effect of a gratitude practice on psychological and physical well-being. So this isn't just about the mind, it's about your health. Here is their study. In our first study, we randomly assigned college students participants of one of three tasks, right? So they were chosen to be of 1, 2, or 3 groups. They either briefly described in a single sentence 5 things they were grateful for. That was the gratitude condition. Or 5 hassles. That was the hassles condition. Or the third group, 5 events or circumstances that affected them. And that was the events condition. Now, he explains, what are hassles? Hassles are relatively minor, everyday, stressful circumstances. For example, not being able to find a babysitter, dealing with the rising price of gas, doing laundry, misplacing your wallet, losing your keys, put those things, those are hassles. Now, the time frame for each of these events was the past week. So participants basically would do these exercises every week, once a week. And they would write down either 5 things they were grateful for, or if you were in the group of hassles, 5 hassles, or if you were in the group of events, you wrote 5 different events or circumstances that just affected you. At the end, participants completed these exercises along with a variety of other measures of health and happiness once per week for 10 consecutive weeks. All right, here are the results, and this is why I love this study. The results were quite striking and garnered considerable media attention. I'm reading from his book. Participants in the gratitude condition felt better about their life as a whole and were more optimistic about the future than participants in either of the other control conditions. To put it in numbers, they were a full 25% happier than the other participants. Those in the gratitude condition those in the gratitude condition reported fewer health complaints and even spent more time exercising. Something as simple as counting blessings once a week resulted in significant emotional and health benefits. I'll just end off with another, I'm not going to read the text, but it's another one of his studies from his book that he said, what's another way to help you be grateful? So clearly we see writing down what you are grateful for impacts you in a very, very positive way. They said if you, in another study of theirs, they said an effective way to deepen your own gratefulness is to write a letter of gratitude to an important person in your life whom you've never properly taken the time to thank. And then you visit that person to present him or her with the letter. And in that one, here his study, obviously for us with COVID, I would suggest that you wait. You can write the letter, but I don't suggest you going to meet them in person right now. I'm not a doctor, but just sharing that. What was the effect of composing and delivering the letter? This is what he said. Their moods were measured after 1 week, and then and participants were happier and less depressed. Now, that boost in happiness, this is what I thought was pretty impressive, was and decrease in depressive symptoms was maintained at a follow-up assessments 1 week and 1 month later. So a gratitude visit is one of the exercises that made people lastingly less depressed and happier than any other positive psychology intervention. So when we talk about gratitude, all of these things that we just shared, you find so steeped in Jewish texts as well. But when you look at these two texts, it works. So when you think and you try to be grateful and you remember what you're grateful for, it will change your mood. Now, does that mean that there isn't such a thing as clinical depression? Of course there is. And is this going to be the answer for someone who also needs to make sure they're taking care of it with a medical professional? No. Will it help? I assume yes. But for most people, these things will make tangible differences in their lives. And that's pretty impressive. So this Thanksgiving, when you do sit down and we have what to complain about, it's a very different Thanksgiving this year. Write down the things you're grateful for. Don't just think it, but do an action. I am writing down what I am grateful for, even though I might be sitting alone or I might be sitting with 2 people instead of 10 or 20 people. Do something actionable to remind you what you are grateful for. I'm going to end with that. But of course, I am happy to take questions, thoughts, or anything on your minds